So this is my trip to the Creation Museum 2 summers ago in Petersburg, Kentucky. It's amazing, I got to tell you. Let's see. This is the Creation Museum. They also have, they built an ark recently, like Noah's Ark. So if you ever get a chance, you should check it out. It's incredible. So, now remember, creationism and what they call intelligent design is it's not science, but we could treat it as science. We could treat the hypothesis that God created the earth and the universe 6,000 plus years ago. That's a prediction, right? And furthermore, that the Creator created everything perfectly, because we're talking intelligence here, intelligent design. And so it turns out there's a way to date the Earth and the rocks and even the whole universe. First of all, we know the universe is actually 13.8 billion years old, not 6,000. And don't give me this stuff about what a day was in the past. Stupid. Also, we do radiometric dating, so we actually know how old certain rocks are and when they were made. And we do that with radioisotopes. For more recent stuff, we use carbon-14. Otherwise, we use a uranium isotope that has a half-life of millions of years. So, right there, we've actually refuted the creation hypothesis, because it posits the Earth is only 6,000 years old. And then there's some other ways to actually date the Earth as well, and points to the same sort of thing. So also, you would think that a creator who was intelligent would create everything perfectly, not with a bunch of crazy stuff like we have, or anything on Earth has in terms of life. So the question is, though, why has most of life on this planet gone extinct? Since it began 3.5 billion years ago. Why do humans choke? Pretty bad design flaw. Why does a man's prostate enlarge over time so that finally he's got prostate problems later in life? It's actually bad design. And why are there vestigial traits like our tailbone with no current function? So that's that. Now, there's some explanations for biological diversity. Okay. First of all, let's do this. Separate creation. So all species were created at once, separately. That means they were individually created and not one group that then changed. Okay? So there was an elephant, there was a giraffe, there was an amoeba, right? All the things on Earth were created separately and perfectly by God. Now, then there's also something called transformation. There's also, it's separate creation, but life actually changes over time. So these are various hypotheses for what we see in terms of life on Earth. And then finally, evolution, species share common ancestry. So all these individual creatures are related to each other. This and this is there's a common ancestor for both previously that they split apart. All of them come back to a common ancestor for all life. And you probably are wondering, why do we know that? Well, all life uses the same genetic code and translates it in the exact same way. So these different kinds of hypotheses or models obviously were believed at various times. Separate creation, well, it's still believed by some people. Certainly transformation was, and then evolution. The Greeks thought about this. I'm sure there were kind of creation myths and all that in Africa with various civilizations, in China, in India. But the Greeks had this idea, let's say Plato, that there was the imperfect ethos. And the allegory of the cave. Anybody know what the allegory of the cave is?
It's the idea that if someone is born into a cave and basically they've lived their entire life in a cave, only looking at the wall, and there's a flame behind them that shows the shadows of objects, they will believe that those shadows are the only things that exist. And if they were to ever leave the cave, they wouldn't believe the outside world. They couldn't cope with it because all they know are those shadows.
Right. So the Platonic universe, essentially there was a real universe. And then there's the universe down here. The real universe was where the gods lived, and also where everything was perfect. Whereas down here, not so. And so in the allegory of the cave, like he said, there was a fellow, and there was a fire, and all he would see would be shadows on the wall. And that's essentially what we're in right now, where we think this is real, but this is actually only a shadow of the real universe. And they believed in something called typological thinking. And what that means is there is a perfect, let's say there's a giraffe. There's a perfect example of a giraffe in the real place, and not here on Earth. Because down here we see variation, which means that it wasn't, there's been mistakes made. So typological thinking is the idealized version of each and everything. And then Aristotle had this great chain of being. Let's see, I can't, oh, that's right. The ladder of intellect. So there was a stone, a flame, a plant, a beast, heaven, an angel, a god, and then Professor Beck at the very top. Okay? So that's the great chain of being. And then, of course, there was the Judeo-Christian creation myth about how the world was created, the universe we live in, and adaptations like an elephant's trunk, or a giraffe's long neck, or our large brain, are adaptations as evidence for God's benevolence. And then finally, in the 18th century, a fellow by the name of Carolus Linnaeus went out to classify everything he could. He's a pretty good botanist. He still believed in God and special creation, but he classified things based on similarity. In fact, that's why in botany today deals with plants, but it also deals with fungi and mushrooms. And because they're both kind of set in place, they're sessile, they don't move anywhere, except their offspring do. And it turns out, though, if we actually sequence plants compared to fungi, fungi are much more closely related to us than they are to plants. So we share a lot more in terms of similar genetics with fungi than we do with plants. Okay? Doesn't seem like that. You could look at it and say, but there's something that's actually misleading. Now, in terms of the history of evolutionary thought, people, before Darwin, people were thinking about evolution. They saw at certain times that things had gone extinct. They found fossils of things that looked similar to organisms that were alive today, but not exactly the same. And so they started thinking about it. Now, one of the first was a guy named Georges Cuvier in Paris. And he was a geologist, among other things, and he noticed that the Paris Basin was actually all fossilized sea bottom with all kinds of creatures in it. And he proposed that perhaps there was a great flood, because remember, we're in Paris, this is not by the sea. And all of a sudden we've got this sea bottom, so at one point there was a catastrophic flood, and that's why we got all these fossils. Now, he didn't think that God, he was an atheist. He just said, this is what happened, that's why we see these fossils where they are. And then there was also a fellow by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who actually came up with the first mechanism for evolution. First of all, he believed in spontaneous generation, and then inheritance of acquired characteristics. So, here I am, 5'3". Now, if I put myself, let's say, on a Spanish rack, and crank it so that over time my body lengthens, and I end up being 6'3". That means that in terms of inheritance of acquired characteristics or use and disuse, that my offspring will also inherit being 6'3" and not 5'3". Okay? Or I go to the gym and I work out and I become a humongous weightlifter, right? And I pass that on to my children. Now, that was the idea at that time in the early 1800s or the early 19th century. And then there was a guy named Charles Lyell, who was a friend of Darwin's, who was older, kind of a mentor. And he was a geologist, and he proposed that, in fact, the same forces that are working today were working in the past. He called that uniformitarianism, in opposition to catastrophic changes like the one with Cuvier. And then he also wrote a little bit about adaptations in terms of life to the environment. But he didn't really, he believed kind of Lamarck's idea of evolution, the mechanism. So, that was the idea that was going on at that time. And then finally, there was Darwin. And Darwin had gone to, I think he'd gone to Oxford or something. He was probably landed gentry. That means he was born to wealth. He didn't have to work. But it was expected that he would do something with his life. And he was thinking of becoming a friar or a vicar. Anybody know what a vicar is? Okay, in the English church, it's kind of like a priest. So he's going to have his own parish, but he was always interested and studied a lot of natural history, and so before he went off to become a priest, he went on this adventure on the Beagle around the world in about a 5-year period, and he was the naturalist on board. The British were sending out ships to explore the earth at that time, find trading opportunities, all that kind of stuff. So this is kind of what we can actually see. Okay, right. Okay, the green is Darwin, and he went all the way across the Atlantic, down the east coast of South America, up the west coast, including the Galapagos, and headed over the Pacific. Now, there was also another fellow at this time, and his name was Alfred Russel Wallace. And there's Wallace right there. And he was not born rich. He was born poor, but he loved natural history, so he went off collecting specimens for his wealthy clients in London and elsewhere in Europe. His first collecting trip went to South America. Unfortunately, when he sent it all back on a ship, the ship sank. But then he did most of his great work in the Southeast Asia and Indonesia. And he was considered the father of biogeography. In other words, the past and present distribution of the world's organisms and where they're living and perhaps why they're living there. He actually came up with the same theory as Darwin. He was a younger man than Darwin. He was about 20 years younger. And he came up with this idea of evolution by natural selection while he was in Indonesia. There was a line called the Wallace line where on one side there's Australia and Melanesia, and on this side there's Southeast Asia, and the organisms on each side of the line are vastly different. And it's because they're separated by a deep trench. Okay. So this is the same sort of thing, Wallace's line. There's marsupials on one side versus placental mammals on the other. Marsupials are like opossums, they have a pouch. So when they give birth, the fetus is very small. It crawls out of the vagina and then up and goes into the pouch and locks onto a nipple and then develops inside the pouch. Kangaroos, the same sort of thing. So there was this one area, if you go to Australia, it's all marsupials. There were no placentals originally. And we'll see why later on. Okay. So, what is evolution? Well, it's actually all about sex and death. You want to have as much of the former while avoiding the latter for as long as you possibly can. That's pretty much it. In fact, that's the definition of evolutionary fitness, which means the ability to pass on your genes to the future generations, is you want to survive long enough to procreate and procreate as many offspring as possible, with the greater chance of some of those offspring producing well and furthering your genetic contribution to future generations. As you know, some people mix sex and death, but it's not really, well, go ahead, I don't care. But I should have brought in like for asphyxiation or something like that. Or, of course, there's always the serial killer. Okay, it turns out religion actually is concerned with the same two things, if you think about it. In Christianity and religions from the Middle East and elsewhere, it's really concerned about surviving and then producing offspring. I mean, it says in the Bible, go forth and multiply and start begetting, right? And obviously people also are terrified of dying, and so there's this life after death that gives people an idea of what's going on. It'll be nicer than just going, it's gone, right? And I can understand why that's rather disturbing, to tell you the truth. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. But I have to say, religious people actually live it. They actually, they've got this life after this scenario, so that takes care of that. And then, of course, you want to have as many children as possible. And so, but those two things, survival and reproduction, are the two essential things for evolution, among other things. Now, anybody, what's evolution? Hi. You. There. No, behind you. You'll get a chance to. Yeah, you do. But first, Jim. Okay. Come on. Okay. Anything else? Can I give you a chance to?
I was going to say pretty much the same thing.
Okay. Okay. Anything else? Hey. Any other ideas about what evolution is? Okay, I'll have to pick someone. All right, what do you think? Don't worry about all these people around. They're nothing. They just, they're actually shadows on the wall, like in Plato. Okay. Okay. So, yeah?
I think of a branching tree, like kind of like.
Ah, okay, good. Let's see. Tree of life. Now, why might there be a tree of life?
I mean, like it stems off, and then those branches can kind of create more branches, which
Mhm.
is the equivalent of a parent spreading their genes.
Oh, okay. So, we all have parents and grandparents and all that. In other words, there are common ancestors. Well, species also have common ancestry. We know this because of the DNA code and all that, but we'll say okay. Anything else?
The ability to adapt.
What?
The ability to adapt.
Okay. And yeah.
Correlation between species and where they originate from.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. That's great. We kind of talked a little bit about that with Wallace and why there's marsupials, only marsupials in Australia, and no placental mammals, for example. What's adaptation? Okay,
Adjusting to the environment.
what?
Adjusting to the environment.
Okay, good. Both of you. So, adaptation is adjusting to the environment so that you're more likely to survive and reproduce. And the only way to get there with adaptation is through evolution by natural selection. And natural selection, no, it doesn't matter. Natural selection is a process that sorts individual organisms with different traits. And so I'll give you an example. They say bigger is better. And in terms of, let's say, humans, it turns out like taller humans seem to have an advantage in a lot of different things. I'm here to prove them wrong, but anyway. And so there's selection, first of all, for, let's say, males to be bigger, because they're usually fighting over females. This is called sexual selection. It's a hypothesis about the likelihood of creating offspring and who's more likely to actually procreate. And so if there's selection on being bigger or taller, then individuals who are that way will leave more offspring with those traits. So with natural selection, you're born with something. You don't become something like taller. And those individuals with the traits that selection favors, in other words, the environment, are the ones that are passed on. Those are the organisms that actually procreate and create offspring. So, this is, there's 5 things that actually evolution involved in the theory of evolution. Evolution happens, in other words, populations change through time, even whether it's the traits they have or the genes they have. Evolution usually happens gradually. Speciation occurs when you have one species and it splits into 2 or more. And then all species share a common ancestry. And so here we have the kind of branching tree. Oh, there we go. Let's see. Here's the ancestor for this whole tree, and we have species A, B, and C. And B and C share a more recent common ancestor than A, so there was also a common ancestor for B and C, and then A, B, and C, there was a common ancestor for all 3. So this is how we show common ancestry. And much of evolutionary change was caused by natural selection, which is a sole process producing adaptation, or the appearance of someone designing something. Evolution makes a bunch of predictions. If life on Earth originated in the distant past, and then evolved, we should see the first detectable traces of life should actually be simple. And in fact, we've got fossils from 3.5 billion years old that are much like cyanobacteria. And only later would more complex forms evolve. If evolution occurred within lineages, and those lineages sometimes split, then we should be able to find examples of traits and species gradually changing over time, and we should sometimes see one lineage dividing into another. If all lineages share common ancestry, those with a more recent common ancestor should have fewer genetic changes than those more distantly related. All organisms share common ancestry, then we should be able to find transitional forms between one species and another, or one group of animals or plants and another. So, birds are actually reptiles, and we've found, in fact, they're dinosaurs, and we've actually found fossils of feathered dinosaurs, and things like that, and whales are another one. We're going to go through all this embryological development, vestigial traits like having a kind of a tailbone, something like that. I think that's, oh, we got more time. Oh, good. Oh, that's right. Okay. And then, so vestigial traits are like whales. Actually, if you look on the pelvis, they've actually got the remnants of leg bones. They don't have legs anymore. Okay? But at one time, their ancestors did. Same thing with snakes. We also have certain things that we've inherited from our ancestors in the distant past. If we actually look at embryology, when an embryo is developing, for all vertebrates, they all go through a stage where they have gills, whether they're a fish or not. And then those gills recede for those vertebrates that live on land compared to fish, things like that. Okay? So these are all called vestigial traits, and there also should be, behind these traits, vestigial genes. In other words, genes that used to have a function, like to turn on other genes to make legs in the whale's ancestor, but that those genes now are dead or turned off. They've got a mistake in them, and they don't do that anymore. In other words, it wouldn't be good to have a whale to have legs in the ocean. And so the ancestors, there was strong selection to lose limbs and instead gain flippers and things to help with locomotion. Anybody know what endemic means? Huh? Okay. Look it up. It's the opposite, by the way, of cosmopolitan. So there should be a lack of endemic organisms that are limited because they can't disperse to oceanic islands like the Hawaiian Islands. So we wouldn't expect to see mammals or amphibians on oceanic islands because to get there would be essentially impossible. We would expect to see perhaps birds and insects and plants with seeds that can be blown, things like that. Did you find endemism?
You want the full definition?
Just, yeah, go ahead.
Endemism is the ecological state of species being unique to a defined geological location, such as an island, nation, country, or a defined zone or habitat type.
Okay, so it means that only that organism, if it's endemic, is found in that one area and nowhere else. We certainly in North America have a bunch of endemic species that are found nowhere else. Other continents, the same sort of thing. Oceanic islands should be composed of organisms that can actually disperse there. And that's what we see. Most similar species, they had to come from somewhere. And oceanic islands are usually created by volcanic activity. So they weren't there, and then over time they're built up into islands. And then they're colonized. So most similar species to those on oceanic islands are usually from the nearest mainland, let's say the nearest continent. Darwin, actually his friend Gould, looked at the Galapagos finches that he had collected and realized that their closest ancestor or cousin was actually on the mainland of South America. Endemism at many scales. Why are there so many marsupials in Australia and virtually no placental mammals? Related rat-eyed birds on continents. Endemism in Africa and South America, where we find things only there and nowhere else. More predictions. Bad design. Now, why would that be a prediction of common ancestry? Anybody? Like jury rigs, not very well designed. Why would that be an example, evidence for common ancestry? Anybody? Okay. Prostate gland, right? Well, it turns out the prostate gland is actually, it surrounds the urethra because it's actually an outgrowth of the wall. So there was originally a urethra, and then instead of creating the gland somewhere off to the side that doesn't press on the urethra, it's in place. Or why are humans prone to choking? Well, our common ancestor years ago was actually a fish with a swim bladder that then slowly evolved a function of being able to take in oxygen from the atmosphere. Or whales that actually show the little limb bones. Some whales are actually born with legs. It's because something's gone haywire, and so they actually grow legs like their ancestors did. Obviously, such a mutation would be usually fatal, and so it wouldn't be passed on. Evolution is largely from natural selection. We'll find out not entirely, but then we should be able to find examples of selection operating on organisms in nature and also under artificial circumstances. And there's all sorts of Galapagos finches where there's evolution in action by natural selection. So in terms of evolutionary ancestry, we've got a fossil record. We've got examples of vestigial organs. We have quirks of development in embryology, like the human embryo also starts out with a tail and then loses it, in addition to the gills. Humans at a certain point develop a layer of hair all over the fetus, and then that's lost, instead of being born hairy, like chimpanzees. Bad design, genetics, where more closely related taxa should have fewer differences in their genetics compared to more distant related. And then there's lots of examples of evolution in time. Now, what's the what is one of the characteristics that a hypothesis must have in terms of finding out whether it's correct or not?
Has to be testable.
Huh?
Hypothesis has to be testable.
Testable. And what usually makes it testable? Falsifiable. You have to be able to prove it wrong. So, if we found these things happening, we would basically falsify Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. If we found a bunny in the Devonian period 400 million years ago, well before there were any mammals, then we would have a problem. Or, like these creationists, they claim to have found tracks of humans and dinosaurs together, you know. But it would be brutal with Tyrannosaurus Rex. Oh God, Adam and Eve were in trouble. Okay. Adaptations, a lack of genetic variation in populations and species. We'll find out that variation is one of the central requirements for evolution to happen. Adaptations in one species, it's not good for that species, but only good for a second species. Adaptations that would not have evolved by a step-by-step process of ever-increasing fitness. In other words, gradually, like an eye. An eye is a very complex organ, and we wouldn't expect a fully formed eye to evolve. We would expect proto-eyes with originally with cells that are photosensitive, let's say. And that's exactly what we see. We see simple eyes, then more advanced eyes, and finally we see the vertebrate eye, or similarly a cephalopod eye, like octopus. Adaptations that are inimical or bad for individuals, but good for the population and species. We'll see why that doesn't work at all. In other words, if you were an altruist, you'd be giving up your own fitness for someone else and you wouldn't be passing on your genes. Altruistic behavior. The only way you should really see it is through relatives who share your DNA. And then discordance between phylogenies based on morphology, like anatomy, right? Arms, legs, all that. And those based on DNA. In other words, genetics. And then greater genetic distance between closer related. No, that's wrong. Greater genetic distances between unrelated species compared to fewer genetic changes between closely related species. Salute. Okay. Okay. So, we finally came to Darwin and Wallace. And we've gone over some of this. Species were not specially created, but were descended from earlier species. All species had a common ancestor. We don't have a really good, we'll probably never be able to show how life originated on the planet. We'll probably be able to create life in a lab so that we show it's possible, but it's unlikely we'll ever know exactly what happened. Species change over time, and individuals vary, providing the source for populations to change. So it turns out populations evolve, not individuals. The process of natural selection is the primary force or mechanism for that change. So Darwin and Wallace's two great ideas: evolution by natural selection, which is a process, and descent from a common ancestor, which is a pattern. You can read this. This is the last paragraph on the origin of species from Darwin. Oh yeah, and evolution essentially means that populations change over time in terms of gene frequencies, different variations of genes. Some individuals have one variation, some another, and that those frequencies should change over time depending on which variation is actually favored by natural selection. Okay. Now, I mentioned what is a population. We'll say a group of individuals of the same species, but you can have a population of widgets too. What is the gene pool? All the alleles and genes in a population. So here we've got two different genes. Oh, there it is. Okay, so this is a two allele, one gene model. That means there's one locus, and in terms of the alleles, they're found on the gametes. okay? And that's why there's only, they're either blue or orange. So there's two alleles there. In other words, you can be blue or you can have an orange allele. And then there's something called genotypes, which are putting those together, one of each, so there's two for each genotype. And in this case, if you have two blues, you end up with a blue chicken. If you end up with two oranges from the gametes, egg and sperm, you end up with an orange chicken. And then you have a green chicken if you have one of each allele. So this is actually the gene pool. The alleles found in all individuals of that population. Okay, an allele. We're going to be using this term. An allele is a variant of a gene. Every individual in this classroom has two alleles for each locus where there's a gene. They have two variations. They can be the same ones or they can be different ones. But you can actually have lots and lots of different alleles, each with different associated traits. So you might have alleles for most traits are actually from multiple genes. But you could have, let's say, an allele, let's say for eye color, it's fairly simple. You have different color eyes because of the different color alleles that you actually inherited from your parents. When you put those alleles together in an individual, you then have the genotype. That means the genes that they actually have, the alleles that they actually have. So in these chickens here, the green one has a blue allele, A1, and it also has an orange allele, A2. A blue chicken has two blue alleles. And then in terms of what the organism looks like and acts, behaves, its physiology, all that kind of stuff, that is called the phenotype. So, we all have a phenotype. We look similar, we're humans, but beyond that, we also vary considerably. So, the essence of the process of evolution is that new variants, alleles, caused by mutations, are constantly entering populations through reproduction, and while other variants are leaving the population by death. Now these variants or mutations have to be heritable. In other words, you have to be able to pass them on from parent to offspring. Or bacteria don't actually have sex, so they just bud. So from a clone of themselves. So this is what it looks like. New variants or new alleles, just by mutation, come into the population. If most of those mutations are probably bad or have no effect. Some might be beneficial. They'll come into the population and stay, and then actually be passed on to future generations. Alleles, other alleles that have, let's say the environment has changed, they will be leaving the population because they're no longer beneficial. So it means allelic frequencies, or the variance in terms of the genes, fluctuates in frequency inside the population. In other words, those chickens might have an environment where there's lots of green vegetation. If you were a chicken, would you be better off being blue, orange, or green? green. Why? Camouflage, right? People like to eat chickens, and also other animals like to eat chickens. And if chickens could fade into the background and not be seen by their predators, and that's under genetic control, then those alleles, both of those alleles would remain in the population, and individuals that were green would have higher fitness, more offspring, because they'd survive longer than anybody else. There's forces of evolution. So there's natural selection. There's also mutation. So natural selection actually has to work on mutation, because mutation is the source of all variation ultimately. And mutations, or alleles, affect traits. There's something called genetic drift. We'll learn about that. There's also non-random mating. In other words, instead of randomly mating in a population like anybody in this room, I could pick people out of a hat randomly and say, go mate. That'd be random mating. Now, you folks would probably be upset about that. And so you would probably want to pick your mate, and then we'd probably have non-random mating. And then there's also something called migration, where an individual with certain alleles travels to another location and brings those alleles with him, and that's gene flow. So evolution is, again, the change in allele frequencies in a population over time. Darwin's first great idea was evolution by natural selection. Where did Darwin get this idea of natural selection? Well, selective breeding. Remember, he was rich. One of his hobbies was breeding pigeons, I think some plants, and I think dogs. Okay? And this is called selective breeding, to get the traits you want in the animals or the plants that you want. Okay? So here we have dogs, all different kinds and sizes of dogs. We have evolution in corn, starting from teosinte down here to more newer corn variants. We have a bunch of pigeons that do all sorts of funny things and look funny. Okay. So, what is natural selection? Anybody?
Survival.
Okay. Survival of the fittest. What does that mean?
The stronger gene adapts and passes on.
Okay. The stronger gene, the more beneficial gene, actually, it doesn't evolve. It actually is a mutation, let's say a mutation. And that mutation, because it's so beneficial, individuals that have that gene, those are the ones that are likely to breed and pass on their genetic material to future generations. Okay, so let me write that down. Okay. Now, I think evolution by natural selection, I think selection is an unfortunate word. Because it kind of implies that someone or something is selecting for certain traits. And that's not true. What it is individuals with certain traits that match their environment, in other words, the cards they've been dealt, are more likely to survive and reproduce. So, in a sense, the environment is selecting individuals because they have the alleles that help them survive and reproduce more than other individuals. So we call it natural selection, but it's not a being that's actually going around selecting things, unless it's artificial selection like we do with selective breeding. Okay, is it possible to have natural selection without evolution, or evolution without natural selection? We'll start there when we come back, okay? So you can think on that. In fact, another thing, the top hat, we should have done something with it. I'm going to close the top hat for scientific method, and I'm going to open some top hat questions that pertain to evolution. Okay? Oh, okay. So if you get it right, you should still vote. Okay. Oh, I'm sure you did, but why don't you just do just want to make it okay, I need glasses.
When will you close it for scientific method?
When I get back to the office.
So today, in a minute?
Right now. Well, actually, no, 2 o'clock.
Okay, thank you.
Email me and I'll put it live, but I'll talk to them. They really don't do a good job of it. What? No, at 2 o'clock. Yeah, yeah. Okay? Anything else? Yeah.
The slides that you put up, what do you use? What do you make the slides on?
Oh, let's see, PowerPoint.
Because what I like to do is print them and write on them.
Yeah.
But printing it,
Yeah.
it's going to print the whole slides. So I was wondering if, like, is there a way you can post it, like, on Google Slides? Or if I email you, can you?
Why, you should be able to print.
Because when I print, if I click print, it prints it, like, the whole slide. 65 slides instead of 3 on a page. You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, okay. I think you can actually.
I've tried doing it through my
Yeah.
It's not letting me. You have to do it because you're administrator.
Right.
So
Oh.
if I email you,
Oh, that's right. That's right.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah, I can do that.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay,
Good.
I'll email you.
I'll do that. So you want like 3 slides per.
Perfect. So I
Right.
can write on it.
Yeah, exactly. No,
Okay.
that's excellent.
Thank you.
Email me
I
about
will.
that.
Okay.